Hi guys, it's Amory, and this is my February wrap-up. Caveat, this is really more like my December, January, February wrap-up. Kind of, sorta. I read a lot of books. It's just life stuff, you know how it happens sometimes, so I just did not do my wrap-up. Sorry for that, guys. But I didn't want to make this really long, so I'm just going to cover my reading highlights for the last 3 months. Let's begin. So I ended up reading Fairest by Marissa Meyer. Even before I began the Lunar Chronicles, I wasn't positive I was going to read Fairest because some people were saying that it wasn't super integral to the plot. I'm so glad that I did because Fairest is actually my second favorite, aside from Cinder, which I really love. Cinder was one of my favorite books of 2015, but I really loved Fairest too. It was so much more than what I expected. I knew we were going to get into the head of someone who's a bit deranged, quite deranged, but I wasn't expecting to feel conflicted. It was done in a way that made me abhor Levana, but at the same time, I felt so terrible when certain things happened and I could kind of understand her desperation. But I thought it was very well done. So Fairest is my second favorite of the Lunar Chronicles. Another thing that I really loved, The Dumb House by John Burnside. I told you guys about this before. It's a man who wants to recreate an experiment. He wonders if he's able to keep children isolated from language, meaning he doesn't speak to them. He doesn't let them hear anyone speaking. He wonders if he'll be able to discover the universal original language, if there even is one. That's what the story is about as far as what the synopsis would say, but honestly, that doesn't really come into play. It's like the motivation and then it comes into play near the end. In my opinion, what this book is really about is an exploration of character and the ways in which sex, death, love, an Oedipal complex, and decay and power mix. This was so disturbing, but deliciously so. I was so taken aback at how much empathy I had for the character while he made me sick. The prose is gorgeous, but very clean. It's really interesting. There's the whole aspect of searching for the universal language, but I feel like that's not really what the story is, unless we're looking at it from the standpoint, perhaps, of searching for the original human language, which is connection, universal connection, which would be sex, death, love, familial love, power, life and death, decay, that kind of thing. In that way, that whole thing connects, but it's not just a fast-paced, thrilling type of read. It's not a thriller. It's character exploration, but definitely well worth your time. One of my favorites of the year so far. The Rest of Us Just Live Here by Patrick Ness. This was such a surprise for me, you guys. Some people really love this novel. At the same time, some of my Goodreads and BookTuber friends were kind of getting mixed reviews with this, so I put it on the back burner. It wasn't that I was never going to read it, but it wasn't high on my priority list. Finally, I just decided to go ahead and pick it up, and because I kept seeing it, and I was like, Amory, you know you're gonna just get this one day, so just get it now. I just had this thirst to read a contemporary fiction, so I went for it. The idea is so clever. In a nutshell, it's about all the regular people who live life and continue to go about their business as the chosen few save the day, whether that's from vampires or aliens or whatever's going on. In this town, something's always happening, like every few years or every couple of decades, and everyone's like, well, you know how that happened. Vampires come in or the aliens, whatever, and then it's always like the cool indie kids who are dealing with it, and then we just kind of just go on with our day. So I thought that was so clever. Each chapter begins with a small section, and it took me a minute to realize that the small section was what's happening elsewhere. Whatever fantastical thing happened, a strange light appears. So as the book progresses, we see what's happening in that storyline and then see what's going on in their lives. And you see a little intersection, a tiny bit, but not totally. Now, sometimes I did find that the dialogue was a bit on the nose, and sometimes it kind of went into that Hallmarky territory. But for the most part, I really love this story. It's a genius idea. I was like, why has this not been done before? Or if it has, why don't I know about it? And it's very cleverly done. Definitely one of my favorites of the year so far. The Grown Up by Gillian Flynn. This is a short story that first appeared in George R.R. Martin's anthology Rogues. It's about a receptionist slash fake psychic who decides to go into this well-to-do neighborhood to help out a lady who's dealing with a possibly psycho son in a haunted house. I'm not going to tell you any more about it because it's already a short story. So anything I tell you is probably going to be too much, but what I can say is just when I was reading it and I was thinking, okay, I know where this is going. It's going in a predictable direction. The author swerved again, and I was very surprised. I loved this one. I loved it so much, and the voice is so strong in this story that I read it and then read it aloud again to my husband just so he could experience the story, and because it was so much fun to read. The voice is so strong. I think Gillian Flynn is really great with voice. She's really able to capture a character in that first person perspective. It's fantastic. Another one of my favorites of this year. All the Birds in the Sky by Charlie Jane Anders. This is a sci-fi fantasy blend. In this story, a young girl and a young boy become friends. One boy is practically a rocket scientist, and the girl has magical / mystical powers or an ability to tap into that mystical, magical realm. So it's kind of like science fiction meets fantasy. Their lives go like this, and then they come back together. The beginning of the story feels very much like YA magical realism. It also has a very fairy tale-esque feel, because there are certain things that happen that just wouldn't happen in real life without explanation. For instance, the parents, in punishing the daughter, put her tray of food underneath the door. There's enough room for the food to go underneath the door, and shove it in. And sometimes, you know, the cheese or toppings of her food might get scraped by the door, and they put it in there. Now, I'm not saying that wouldn't happen in real life, but if it happened in real life, it'd be a darker story. The psychology of the parents would be explored in the book. We'd understand why that's happening. It'd just be a different kind of story. In this story, that's just what happens when they're punishing her. So it's a bit fantastical, a bit exaggerated. That's what gives it the fairy tale feel. But then the story kind of changes vibe as they get older. It becomes a little grittier. And I liked that too. Although the tone felt so different, it was a bit jarring. I enjoyed the story, but I didn't love it. And I think the reason why I didn't love it was there's so much there to be explored. Like, the book is not super long, but the font is really small. There are so many elements in this story. The magical aspect, the science fiction aspect, the relationships, what's happening to the world. But we don't really get deep into any of them, even with the characters, as far as developing the characters for the reader. I didn't feel like we were able to go in depth enough with it. There were some parts that the author said were cut out, a lot of backstory type things, and I think those actually might have been really great, because I think I would have been able to sit in the world a bit more. And that's another thing, because this is about the end of the world, possibly coming to an end, and how the male character is playing into that and his future invention, and then how it could possibly be saved by the young girl and her friends. But you never really feel the energy of the apocalypse. I never really felt what the people were going through outside of the main characters, but just what's happening in the world. How's the world affected on an emotional level, politically, just giving me more of that. In general, I felt like there was so much to the story, but we only got here and we didn't get all of this. And that's kind of my general feeling with it. Which is why, although I'd say this isn't one of my favorite reads of the last 3 months, some of the things about this are so fantastic, and there's so much potential here. I couldn't stop thinking about the book and what we could have seen. So it still managed to stick with me. The Best American Science Fiction and Fantasy. This is edited by Joe Hill and John Joseph Adams. I think the stories in this collection fell all across the spectrum of very genre to, I want to say very literary, but literary can be anything, because it's a genre and a style in and of itself. There are some stories that are more rooted in science fiction and fantasy, and that is definitely the focal point, and other stories that are rooted very much in the character and what's happening to them. Although the genre stories are about character and what happens to them, the literary stories can almost forego some of the genre elements sometimes, the world building or other aspects, to just focus on that. So it depends on what you want. For instance, a story that's taking place in space could be all about the space, all about the science, like Neil Stephenson's Seven Eves, or it could be very much about a family and what's happening to them, and you might not even know much about the science or the world building at all. It might not be stressed in the story. In any case, this kind of like fell in there. Very much a combination of genre, literary, interstitial fiction. The stories ran the gamut. Let me tell you some of my favorites. Help Me Follow My Sister into the Land of the Dead by Carmen Maria Machado. Elia Don Johnson's A Guide to the Fruits of Hawaii, a very cool take on vampires. And if you think you're tired of vampires, you should definitely check her story out. It's very cool. And I definitely will be checking out more of her work. Samaria from the Journal of Imaginary Anthropology by Theodore Goss. There was a story called Windows by Susan Palwick, which was really, really short. I wanted more, but at the same time, although I wanted more from the story, it just stuck with me. At first I was thinking, oh, I'm not going to consider it one of my favorites, but I could not stop thinking about it. There was something heart-wrenching. It's about a woman who has 2 children. Her son is in prison and her other daughter is on this ship that's supposed to populate another planet because Earth is dying. These people won the lottery and they're going to repopulate another planet. And while she's visiting her son to say happy birthday in prison, very real, very grounded, they get word that there's been a fire on the ship, and that's it. There's no other communication. And all she can do is look at the sky and wonder and hope. That's it. It was just such a touching story and so real because the story was rooted in a mother's love for her children and also humanity and what would happen to humanity if we were in a situation in which there's only one ship that can save the human race. Oh, and the girl was pregnant on top of that. So I just couldn't stop thinking of it. And I was like, oh, this is definitely one of my favorites. Daniel H. Wilson's The Blue Afternoon That Lasted Forever. Daniel H. Wilson wrote Robopocalypse. I read that book a long time ago and I really enjoyed that one. But this was just so touching and so gut-wrenching. And I actually told him on Twitter how much I enjoyed his story. And he said that the story is very close to his heart. He incorporated part of his routine with his daughter, like their bedtime routine. And that was probably one of my favorite stories too. That might have been my favorite one. That one in Windows and Elia Dawn Johnson's story. This is definitely worth getting, guys. Definitely worth checking out from your library. Definitely worth purchasing if you like to read short stories and own short story collections. Highly recommend. I will definitely be getting the next one next year. Really enjoyed Saga Volume 5. Loved it. I read it in one day. Volume 1 is my favorite. 2 and 3 were okay. Volume 4 was great. Volume 5 also great. I was like, I can't tell you what happened, but I'm loving it. I'm contemplating purchasing the full set because I've been reading it all from the library. I think I own 1 or 2, and the rest of them were all library loans on my ebook. Highly recommend that graphic novel series. That and Lock and Key. I know I'm always telling you guys about Lock and Key. Read it. Just read it. A Gathering of Shadows by V.E. Schwab. If you guys haven't read this series yet already, what are you waiting for? I love V.E. Schwab's work. Vicious was absolutely fantastic. There's going to be a sequel for that. I won't tell you too much about this because this is the second book in a series, so that would be spoilery. We learn more about the world. I really loved how the side characters came to life for this. I cannot wait to get the third book, but we will be waiting for a long time because that's an entire year from now. That's the bad thing about reading things early. I love this world and I love the characters and the side characters. Yes, just yes. Ruta Sepetys' Salt to the Sea blew me away. I almost cried 3 times while reading this story. First of all, it's about the story of the biggest maritime disaster in history that no one knew about because the Nazis kept it secret. Almost 10,000 people died in the Baltic Sea because they were torpedoed during World War II, and no one knows about this. I thought it was fantastic that Ruta Sepetys wrote about this, and while I was reading it, I was also watching interviews where she was talking about what inspired her and her family background and talking to people who survived the events. It really just brought me to tears. I've never read her work before. I have Between Shades of Grey. I've had that paperback for a long time on my shelves, haven't read it. I will remedy that quickly, and I'll also be reading Out of the Easy. She just blew me away. On a writing craft level, I was so impressed by the circularity of the story. The chapters were short and tense. I actually went online to research the ship and look at the ship wreckage. I just was so immersed. I highly recommend this. Even if you don't typically read historical fiction, I would definitely recommend checking out this book. One side craft note that I was thinking about while reading the story was the question of how much information to give when you're writing in a certain perspective. When you're writing a close third person or a first person, it makes me wonder what's fair in the way that information is delivered to the reader. For instance, how do you feel when you're reading something and it's I do this, I do this, I do that, I walk to the door and I open it and on the doorknob something hangs. I pick it up and I walk to the phone. I know what I have to do. I'm curious, do you feel like it's a cheat if what's on the doorknob is not told? Because if we're in first person, you're seeing everything through the character's eyes. Everything's happening to the character and you're feeling it. For me, sometimes it feels like it's a cheat. When the information is withheld to increase suspense, you're not withholding anything else. So when it's an opportune moment, it feels more like a cheat. Unless the first person narrative is someone actually telling you the story. Like, this is what happened to me, and I'm now telling you this story that is within the story's narrative, then you would understand why that person's not telling you. Whenever I encounter that, I do wonder, because usually if I do encounter it, it'll only happen a couple of times in that story at very opportune moments. And then I'm like, no, you can't do that. We've been in this person's head all this time, and then all of a sudden you're like, and then he tells me something, and I hang up the phone. You can't just tell me everything that's happening and all of a sudden you just leave that part out, because up until this point there's never been a wall between the reader and the character. It's just interesting. Anyhow, it's something that I've been thinking a lot about too while I've been reading The Count of Monte Cristo, because there are certain moments where this happens. So in this story, the narrator is omniscient third person past tense. There's a lot of head hopping. We see what's going on with the different characters, but sometimes something will happen. For instance, a man whispers into the Count of Monte Cristo's ear and the Count said something and both men left the room. And it's kind of like, it feels a bit like a cheat to me in that instance. I'm enjoying the read, by the way. If you guys don't know, I've been buddy reading this with Nena at SCS Reads, and I'm really enjoying it, but it did bring this point to mind with the whole withholding of information. Is it fair? Is it not fair? Is it a cheat? Is it not a cheat? Let me know what you think. So that was my February wrap up, aka a little bit of December, a little bit of January. Don't forget to like the video if you liked it. Please share the video and don't forget to subscribe. Until next time, I will see you later. Bye! Every story needs a hero, every story needs a villain, every story needs a secret. I don't know anything else about this story because the synopsis is extremely vague, but I know the cover is stunning, number one. It's almost as stunning as the author's prose. You got it, you got it. OMG!